Behind the scenes, NATO is crumbling rapidly. People are all looking for off ramps, but they're all stuck in the same position. How do you stand up and say, "Oh gosh, I'm sorry, I was wrong"? What could Lyndon Johnson say in 1968? I didn't understand what I was doing. I'm in over my head. It's the same routine. They just haven't found a way to quietly withdraw. And ultimately, I think what will happen is that everyone will turn against Washington. Washington will have been the enemy that dragged them into a war they never wanted to fight, because there's no support for the war against Russia in Ukraine anywhere in Europe. Nobody's suiting up and ready to go anywhere. It's nonsense.
Douglas Macgregor's statement reveals a sobering truth about the unraveling unity within NATO and Europe's growing disillusionment with Washington. Behind the diplomatic front, cracks are widening among NATO members, who increasingly recognize that the costs of prolonged involvement in the Ukraine conflict are simply too high. Macgregor compares NATO's predicament to President Lyndon Johnson's struggles during the Vietnam War, highlighting how difficult it can be for leaders to admit strategic miscalculations. However, unlike in 1968, NATO is not just a single nation grappling with an unpopular war. It's a multinational alliance strained by diverging interests, economic hardships, and a lack of enthusiasm for continued military escalation. For decades, NATO's unity was upheld by a shared goal: to counter perceived threats, largely from Russia. However, the Ukraine war has exposed rifts within the alliance. Many European countries find themselves grappling with domestic crises and are questioning the wisdom of supporting a prolonged conflict. They are looking for ways to step back, but doing so would involve admitting to their populations that the war strategy has faltered. Macgregor's observation that NATO members are looking for off-ramps, but struggling to take them reflects this dilemma. Leaders face immense pressure to maintain a united front, even when the rationale for war is no longer compelling for many of their citizens. This discomfort with the current strategy is, as he suggests, leading to an undercurrent of resentment directed toward Washington. From the perspective of many NATO countries, Washington's insistence on supporting Ukraine, no matter the cost, has put Europe in a difficult position. Energy shortages, economic strain, and social unrest are all consequences felt by European citizens who never wanted to see their resources and attention diverted to a far-off conflict. These pressures are fueling a quiet discontent with the U.S., whose leadership on this issue is increasingly seen as self-serving. Macgregor suggests that this resentment may eventually culminate in open opposition to Washington. If European leaders do decide to distance themselves from the U.S. stance, it would represent a major shift in the alliance, one with far-reaching implications for the structure and future of NATO. A mass retreat would mark a historical realignment, shaking the foundations of an alliance that has held firm since the Cold War era. Macgregor's comparison to Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War struggle highlights the difficulty leaders face when a military engagement becomes unpopular or unwinnable. During the Vietnam War, Johnson could not find an easy way to extricate the U.S. without admitting defeat. Similarly, NATO countries are now entangled in a conflict with no clear path to victory, yet they face the daunting task of finding an exit without appearing weak or hypocritical. For NATO, pulling back from Ukraine risks public backlash and accusations of betrayal. However, the alternative, an indefinite commitment to a costly and unpopular war, may be equally unsustainable. Just as the Vietnam War led to intense domestic opposition and a re-evaluation of American foreign policy, the Ukraine war could trigger a similar process within NATO, especially if economic conditions worsen in Europe. One of the starkest points Macgregor raises is the lack of support across Europe for the war against Russia. While NATO's leaders have voiced strong support for Ukraine, the sentiment among European citizens tells a different story. Across the continent, surveys indicate that enthusiasm for direct involvement in the war is low, with many Europeans questioning whether their countries should be involved at all. This disconnect between leaders and citizens adds a layer of complexity. Leaders are reluctant to reverse their commitments to Ukraine, fearing political fallout. Yet the public skepticism grows as energy prices rise, inflation surges, and the costs of supporting Ukraine mount. As long as the public remains unconvinced, NATO countries will struggle to justify sustained involvement in the conflict. If NATO countries begin openly challenging Washington's direction on Ukraine, the alliance itself may undergo significant changes. What was once a unified front could fracture into a coalition where each member pursues its own interests, potentially leading to a Europe more willing to negotiate directly with Russia and less inclined to follow the U.S. lead. This shift could result in a transformed NATO, one that is less U.S.-centric and more focused on European interests. A realignment of this scale would alter the global balance of power, as Europe could adopt a more independent foreign policy approach. Such a change might also lead to a reduced role for the U.S. in European security, as countries seek to avoid entanglements that could bring unintended consequences. As leaders face growing public pressure to de-escalate, continuing to ignore this sentiment could lead to a political backlash. If European leaders insist on following Washington's path in Ukraine despite widespread disapproval, they risk losing support at home. In democratic societies, where public opinion can drive policy, this disconnect could fuel populist movements, particularly those skeptical of NATO's stance and the influence of the U.S. over European policy. Such political shifts could see NATO's influence wane as national priorities take precedence. The emergence of populist or nationalist parties across Europe has already shown that citizens are increasingly questioning the benefits of extensive foreign entanglements. A similar sentiment could drive European leaders to advocate for a more restrained approach, prioritizing economic stability over military commitments. If NATO weakens or fractures, the global order would undergo a significant transformation. Other powers, such as China and Russia, may view this as an opportunity to strengthen their own influence, especially in regions where NATO previously held sway. The geopolitical landscape would shift, with alliances realigning and new blocs potentially emerging to fill the void left by a weakened NATO. For the U.S., a weakened NATO would be a strategic setback, limiting its ability to project power in Europe and, by extension, globally. The implications would extend beyond Europe, affecting U.S. influence in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. A less cohesive NATO could also embolden adversaries, increasing the risk of conflict in other regions as deterrence diminishes. Macgregor's analysis suggests that NATO and Europe are at a crossroads. The Ukraine conflict has laid bare the limitations of unity within NATO, revealing fault lines that may soon be impossible to ignore. As economic hardships mount and public opposition to the war grows, Europe's leaders must weigh their options carefully. Should they continue down the current path, risking further division, or seek an off-ramp that could redefine NATO's purpose in a new era? The outcome remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. The decisions made in the coming months will shape not only NATO's future, but also the geopolitical landscape for years to come. Macgregor's insights offer a warning and a challenge, one that leaders would do well to heed as they navigate the complex realities of a world where alliances, once thought unbreakable, now stand on uncertain ground. According to Douglas Macgregor, behind the scenes, NATO is crumbling rapidly. People are looking for off-ramps, but they're stuck. How do you stand up and admit, "Oh gosh, I was wrong"? It's like Lyndon Johnson in 1968. He couldn't just say, "I didn't understand what I was doing. I'm in over my head." It's the same thing here. They just haven't found a way to quietly withdraw. Ultimately, I think everyone will turn against Washington. Washington will be seen as the enemy that dragged them into a war they never wanted to fight. There's no support for the war against Russia and Ukraine anywhere in Europe. No one's gearing up. No one's ready to go. It's nonsense. Thanks for watching.